In this second part series of our tutorial, you focus on working with Appwrite databases. You'll learn how to set up a database in Appwrite, interact with it from your Flutter app. You also perform CRUD operations such as creating tags, reading tags, and also updating tags and deleting tags as well. So let's get started. We already have our account initialized, which we make use of that in registering the user, logging the user in, and logging the user out, right? So let's proceed to initialize our database. So over here, we initialize our database. So below the account, we're going to have our databases, which is coming from the Appwrite, and it's going to be databases. Then we initialize that passing the client. So we pass our database down to my app over here, and we need to require that in the constructor of my app widget, right? So just as we did for the account, the same thing will be done over here. So we need to require this dot databases. So another way to go about this is to create a separate class where you can initialize everything and bring in over here. So once my app has access to the database, you can also pass down to the home page as well, right? So the home page is going to take in the databases, and we also need to do something similar or same thing in the home page by passing down in the constructor. So once you have that, we can finally create our database instance over here. So we now have our database. So let's move on to our console and create our database. So before we do that, let's add two more controllers to this text editing controller. So we are going to take in the title over here, and we are also going to take in the description. There you go. So let's create our database. So on your console, the database session, you hit create database, then you proceed to give the name of the database. So I'm going to name it as the tags DB and hit on the create. So it will automatically be assigned an ID over here, and let's proceed to create a collection. And you're going to have a tax collection. So I'm going to name this as a tax collection. I'm going to leave the collection ID as default, which will be automatically generated for me, as you can see over here. There you go. So we've now created a database. So I'd like to create a file in the lib directory, and it's going to be a .dat file. So I'm going to name this file as the app config, which is going to hold our configurations of so I'll be creating a class of app config, and within this app config, we are going to set up our tags DB. So started const string, then the name is going to be database ID, right? So we need the database ID. So we need to assign this database ID a value, right, which we will get out from the console. So back to the console, we can access the database ID right here. So I'll copy that and place it in a string. We also need the database collection ID. So I'll create a variable of database collection ID. So I need to get that from the console as well. So you move into your tags collection, and you can grab the ID over here and replace it. There you go. Since we are within our config, let's proceed to also set up the project ID as well, right? So I'm going to have our project ID, and within the main of that file, we can get our project ID over here, and we can just replace it with our project ID. So once we have this configuration, we can save in the changes, and where we are setting the project ID, we can access that from the app config. Then we can access the project ID just like this. There we go. So let's proceed over here. The next step is to proceed to create an attribute for this task collection, how we want our data to be structured. So the first one is going to be a string, and the attribute key is going to be the title. We are going to take in the title, and the size is going to be 20. And you can hit on create button. The next one is also going to be a string as well, and the attribute key is going to be the description, and the size, let's increase it to 30, and create this attribute. And lastly, the last one is going to be a boolean, which is going to indicate whether the task is completed or not, right? So the attribute key is going to be completed and the default value is going to be false. So you can hit on create. There we go. So this is how we want to structure our data. So once we have that structured, let's proceed over here. So we need to do one more thing. So within our task collection, under the settings, let's set our permissions. So we need to add a role. So for now, you let anybody to have access to create, read, update, and also delete. So let's update that. There we go. So back to the code. Within our home page below over here, I'm going to create a variable of tags, which is going to hold our various tags. So it's going to be of type a list of documents, right? And initially assign it an empty array. So let's import that from the Appwrite models.dat. So once we have that over here, let's proceed to create our tags. So let's create a functionality. So we are going to have a function, and the return type is going to be a boolean, where we are going to have the function name to be create tags. So this create tags takes in the title and the description, which they are all going to be of type string. So within the create tags over here, we are going to expect a title and a string, right? So over here, we are going to use try catch, and in our try block, so in creating a new task, we first of all create a variable of final new task, which we can await and call our database, which in our case is going to be widget.databases. Then we can create a document. So in creating of a document, it takes in the database ID, the collection ID, the document ID, and also the data, right? So let's do that. So in taking the database ID, you can access the database ID from the app config.database ID, right? And also the collection ID is going to be app config.database collection ID. So with the document ID, that's going to be uniquely generated, right? So we can use the id.unique to generate an ID for this new tags, and that's going to be id.unique. And finally, we need to pass down the data, right? So the data is going to be an object, which is going to take in the title and the description, where we can pass in the title and the description. So lastly, so it also takes in the completed. So this structure should be similar to how you structured in a database from our console, Appwrite console. And finally, we can set states and update our tags by adding the new tags. Then we can handle the exception. So I'm going to handle on Appwrite exception. Then we can catch any error we get over here by printing the error, and later on return false, since the return type is a boolean. So we can return true over here. So basically, in creating a task, we take in the title and the description, and we create a new task using our database.create document, where we need to pass in the database ID, collection ID, and also the document ID. So the document ID is uniquely created over here. Then finally, we need to pass in our data. So that's basically it. Yeah, so over here, the next step is to get the list of tags we've created, and for that, I'll be copying that and paste in and make some few modifications, right? So the function name is going to be get tags, which is not going to take in any parameter. So I'll get rid of these parameters, and the return type is going to be a boolean, and we are going to have a response in getting tags, right? So it's going to be await widget.databases.list documents. So in listing of documents over here, we take in the collection ID, the database ID, and that's it, right? So we can finally return the response.document, and that's it. So the return type of this is going to be a list of documents, right? So we need to change that from a boolean to a list of documents, right? So in getting the tags, we're going to have a list of tags we've created, and that's going to come in the form of a list of documents. So we need to modify that. There you go. And if you have any exception, we can just return an empty array. So that's it for getting the tags. So we list the documents, passing our database ID and also the collection ID. So let's move on to the next functionality, which is updating a particular tax, right? So in updating a particular tax, the return type is going to be a boolean, and the function name is going to change to be update tax, which is going to require the tax ID and the particular field we are going to update, right? So in our case, we are only going to update the completed field in our case, right? So we take in the tax ID and completed, which comes as a boolean, and we are going to create a variable, rename this variable to be the updated tax, and we await databases.update document, right? So in updating a document, we need to pass in the database ID and also the collection ID and the document ID, that particular document we want to update, and pass that. So once we have that, we can pass in the data and the field we want to update, which is going to be the completed field. So you can add the additional field in your case. So over here, let's make sure we know that particular tax we want to update, and for that I'll be creating an index and loop through to check for the tax we want to update if it's equal to the tax ID being passed in. And once we get our index, we make a check if our index is not equal to -1, which means we really have our tax in here, so we can update our tax and pass in the index with the updated tax. So once we have that, we can finally return a true for updating of that tax, and if you have any exception, you can return false. So the last functionality is to delete a particular tax over here, and in deleting a tax, we need to pass in the tax ID, right? And the return type of this is going to be a boolean, right? And the function name is going to change to delete tax. So in deletion of tax, we need to pass in the tax ID, which comes as a string, and we can just remove the response variable over here and simply await and delete documents, right? So in deletion of the documents, we need to pass in the database ID and the collection ID, then the document ID, which is that particular document we want to delete. Then we can finally return true, and if any exception happens, we can return false for that case. Yeah, so those are the functionalities for creating a task, getting a task, updating a task, and finally deletion of task. So the next step is to work with the UI. So at the top over here, within our init state, let's initially fetch the task once the app runs for the first time, and for that I'll be creating a function in the init state that will fetch our task over here. So below over here, I'll be creating a function that will fetch our task, and it's going to be of type feature of void, and the function name is going to be fetch tax. So in fetching of tax, we simply call our get tax function and assign it to the tax over here. So our tax is going to be awaiting, then we call our function that will get us the tax, and finally we can set the state, and this will load our tax we've created into our tax variable. So once we have this, we can proceed to work on the UI aspect and add our functionality. So let's do that. Yeah, so let's proceed with the UI over here. So below the row, are going to have a sizable for spacing, and are going to change in here to height of 24. So below the size box, we are going to have a center, and the child of the center is going to be a test widget that's going to display the test, the database operations. So let's proceed to start this test, right? So with a test style, we can change in the font size over here, and you need to change the font size to be 20. I think that should be it for it. And below the center widget over here, let's return an expanded widget, right? And the child of this expanded widget is going to be based on the tax collection, right? We check if our tax is not empty. So if our tax is empty, we are going to return a center widget with a test that displays no tax. So that will be displaying no tags yet, and if our tags is not empty, we are going to display our various tags, and for that we are going to use listView.builder. And this listView.builder takes in the item builder, and the item builder is a function that takes in the context and the index over here. Oops. So it takes in the context and the index, and we can return something, right? So the listView.builder also takes in the item count, and that's going to be based on our tags length, right? There are various tags, and that's going to be tags.length. And in our item builder over here, we can extract our individual tags, right? So I'll create a variable to hold our tags based on the index. And below that, we are going to return dismissible that takes in the key and the child, right? So this dismissible, the key is going to be holding the key where we can pass in our tags.id, right? So the key in here needs to be unique. So the reason why we are returning dismissible is because we want to add the delete functionality where we will know that particular tags we want to delete, right? So the child of this dismissible is going to be the checkbox list style that takes in the value. So the value in here will be based on whether our tags is completed, right? So we are going to render tags.data.completed. That comes as a boolean, right? So the value expects a boolean. So initially it's going to be false, and we have unchanged over here. So within this unchanged, it takes in the value, and in this value we can update our tags, right? So once the person choose to set the completed to maybe false or true, we can update that. So we check if our value is not equal to null, we can call our function update tags, and we need to pass in the tags ID and the value. There you go, just like this. And there are a few more things to do, right? We need to display the title and the descriptions as well, right? So with the checkbox list style, we can pass in the title where we can pass in the data.title, right? Data, then tags.data, then we can pass in the title field. And we also have the subtitle that comes below the title. So, and for this subtitle, we are going to pass in the tags, do something similar by passing the descriptions over here as well. And I think that's basically it. So basically we are looping through the tags and check if it's not empty. We display the various tags over here. And in displaying the various tags, so with a dismissible, it takes in the undismiss, right? That's a function where we can call our delete tags function. So in deletion of tags, we need to pass in the tags ID, and can have access to the tags ID over here. And let's set a background to this dismissible, and it's going to return a container. It's going to return a container, and the color of this container is going to be a red, and the child of this container is going to be an icon as well, right? So let's also set an alignment over here to be at the center, right? And also the child of this container is going to be an icon, and in here the icon name is going to be the delete icon, which is going to be icon into brackets icons.delete, and we proceed to give the color of the icon, which is going to be colors.white. And I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, so we check through our tags. If it's empty, we display this. If it's not empty, we display our various tags over here, and we are going to return a checkbox list style, display our title and description, pass in our value, and when we want to change the tags, we call the update tags method, right? So the last functionality is to add a particular tags, and for that we are going to place that in the floating action button, right? So I'll pass in the floating action button that takes in the unpressed and also the child, right? So the child of this floating action button is going to be a button, the add button, right? So it's going to be icons.add. So everything is minimalistic over here. You can build complex thing with this, right? So just for demonstration's sake, so the unpressed of this floating action button is going to show a dialog, right? So and for that we are going to use the show dialog method that takes in the context and also the builder, and the builder in here is a function that takes in the context and return something, right? So in showing a dialog, we are going to return the alert dialog, right? So in here, we are going to return the alert dialog. Oops, the copilot is disturbing me over here. So we return the alert dialog and we show the title in here. The title is going to basically be our tags, and also we pass in the content. So we are going to return a column in here, and we're going to have a children, and in this children, first of all, we set the main access element to be supposed to be main access size to be main access size dot min. Yeah. And the children of the column, we're going to have two text fields, right? So the first text field, we pass in the controller, and the controller in here is going to be our title controller, and we also pass in some decoration displaying the label text, right? So input decoration then is going to hold our title. So I'll copy that and repeat this text field one more time, and changing the controller over here to be the description controller, and the label text to be the description. So the alert dialog also comes with the actions where we can place buttons, right? So our first button is going to be a text button, right? It comes with the onPress and the child, and the child of this first text button is going to be a text of cancel. That's when you want to cancel all these operations. So in canceling, we just pop off the dialog by using navigator.pop, passing the context over here. And I think that should be it. And we also need one more text button over here. So this text button will be responsible for adding a text, right? So the text is going to change to be add, and the functionality in here, which is found within the onPress, we will be calling our create text function, right? So before we do that, let's make a check to know that if our title controller and also description controller is not empty. So we check our title controller text if it's not empty. At the same time, we also check if our description controller text is not empty. Then we can proceed to create a text, passing in the various values. Then we can pop off the context. And I think that's basically it. That's the functionality in these CRUD operations, and all we need to do is run the app and test. Yeah, so this is it. Let's proceed to create a text. So in here, expect the title to be passing. So I'll pass in first text, and also the description over here, which is going to be description here. And we can click on add. And there we go. We have our text. And when we refresh our Appwrite console, we can see our newly created text over here, where they set to be 4. So let's try and update the completed field and refresh the console and see. And there we go. We have our update functionality working. So let's add another text and try to delete a particular text as well, right? So in addition, the title over here is going to be another text. And there we go, we have another text. And when we refresh our Appwrite console, we see our document is added, right? So we can delete that particular text as well. So that's it. Creation of text work, updating of text also work, deletion of text. See you in our next tutorial. Until then, stay tuned.